Looks like we are live. Okay, I'll give it another minute for people to start trickling in. Let's see if I'm going to check on Substack. Make sure it's live. It's hard to see where the live feed on Substack is. It doesn't show up in an obvious place. Okay. Yeah, Timber, can you come back on and let me know how many people are on Substack or wherever we're tracking numbers? Kind of hard to see.
Yeah, sometimes this isn't the most reliable platform in terms of numbers, but right now we've got 9 people on Substack and I think 13 people on YouTube.
All right, that seems like a quorum.
Yeah, quickly climbing. So.
All right, that's good. All right, so it looks like we have about 20 people and more will trickle in. So thanks everybody for joining. Once in a while, I like to kind of try and do big talks that bring together a lot of themes that I'm thinking about. Yeah, I think because I'm fundamentally an essayist and some of these things are basically book length ideas and I don't like writing books. My way of doing that is to come up with like big messy talks. So this is, I would say, a book-sized idea. For a book I'm probably not going to write. And this converges like a lot of thinking I've been doing around my work with the Summer of Protocols program. But I also do work in AI with Tense Torrent, one of my long-term clients. So there's a lot of thinking coming from that context as well. Plus a lot of my own thinking that's been in my blogging for, I don't know, more than 10 years. Some of the themes, if you read the essay I posted yesterday, you'll see that I refer back to like things I've written like in some cases more than 10 years ago. All right, so Cosmopolis, Metropolis, nation state. 3 units for thinking about the world, and I kind of want to like talk mainly about the first one since the other 2 are relatively familiar. And I want to give you a particular way of thinking about them as protocols for articulating civilizational memory. And there's going to be a twist in that subtitle there. All right, let me have to switch back and forth between my actual slides and the screen. Okay, so the big question I want to talk about today is what does it mean to be a cosmopolitan, right? So this is something that we took for granted about 15 years ago. I thought of myself as a cosmopolitan. I liked being one. I liked the cosmopolitan world that we were in and where it was headed. And then, of course, things went in very different directions. And in certain parts of the world, cosmopolitan became a term for a kind of villain, right? So, so setting that aside, there's a whole bunch of things worth asking. Like, is a cosmopolitan the same thing as a globalist? Is it like, you know, a big city type like New Yorkers and Londoners and people like that? How is being a cosmopolitan different from being a nationalist? And is it a betrayal or subversion of nationalism, as a lot of people like to claim, right? So cosmopolitans are like often a favorite punching bag. So why are they the target, right? And how is it different from being metropolitan? So a lot of people define a cosmopolis as basically a kind of metropolis. So if you look up the dictionary definition, you'll notice one definition is a cosmopolis is like a metropolis, except you know it's got a large global population. That's not my definition. I'll give you a different definition. But okay, how is all this related to technology, and what do protocols have to do with this? Which is, of course, since I'm doing this as part of the Summer Protocols, that's going to be an emphasis. And the biggest question is, why do we care? So we'll try and get at answers to all these small questions. But yeah, the first question in this list of 10 is, what does it mean to be cosmopolitan? But I want to like refactor and redirect this whole set of questions from, you know, the personal identity of cosmopolitan to this noun cosmopolis. Okay, so what is a cosmopolis? If we can figure that out, maybe we can figure out who cosmopolitans are and what it means to become or be one. Some backstage details. This is really early thinking, so I think of this as kind of the research version of this talk. So there'll be bugs, messiness. I'm not great at like simplifying things, so it might be a little bit obscure. Especially if you've not been keeping up with some of the work we've been doing in the summer protocols. And I'm also synthesizing some of what other people are doing in the program. I will be trying to do a simplified version of this talk on September 15th as part of the protocol school. More about that like towards the end of the talk. And there's also kind of like a more mathematical or logical foundations version of this thinking that's going on in a special interest group I run. And that'll also be the focus of the Protocol Foundations workshop, which is September 12th to 13th, which is just before the Protocol School. So both of them are part of this thing we're calling the Protocol Symposium. And I'm also planning to eventually do like a more polished version of this talk in November at DevConnect, which is a major Ethereum event. And we'll see how that goes. And yesterday I released an essay, which is kind of a prequel to this talk called Welcome to the Cosmopolis. Read that if you're interested. That's also kind of researchy, so not exactly the most, digestible one of my essays. So that's enough of backstage. All right, so the first part of this talk is going to be the building blocks. So I'm going to introduce a set of building blocks to help you think about the world in a certain way that, among other things, will also help you think about this notion of a cosmopolis, okay? All right, I always like to start with building intuitions with examples. So both examples and non-examples. So what do I mean by a cosmopolis? Here's a whole bunch. Cosmopolis of print, the English language cosmopolis, so people who speak it, the world of steppe nomads, in Eurasia, so Mongols, Turks, people like that, until about 1400 when that culture started disappearing. The culture of pre-Columbian Plains Indians before Europeans arrived. There's a whole bunch, chivalric culture, knighthood, and medieval tournaments, that kind of thing. That's Cosmopolis. The Islamic world at its peak, say 1100. Sometimes the word Ummah is used to describe that whole community in North Africa, Middle East. I would call that a cosmopolis. The phrase Sanskrit cosmopolis is often used for pre-Islamic Southeast Asia. I just learned that last year, and there's a whole interesting thing there, which I should have known about, but was a surprise to me. But you can also think of modern ones, like frequent flyers sitting in planes or transiting through airports. You can think of that as a frequent flyer cosmopolis. People driving in cars, we'll double click on that example a bit, automotive cosmopolis. And finally, the Chinese and Western internets are two different computational cosmopolises. And some non-examples, for a long time, I thought things like the Olympics and the modern versions of world fairs where, nations basically go to brag, they kind of look like cosmopolitan milieux, but they're not really. Very narrow worlds like the art world or the think tank circuit, they're not cosmopolises. Things like, say, the Mar-a-Lago scene around which, the Trump political movement congregates, that's not a cosmopolis. That's, closer to an imperial milieu. So lots of things might look like cosmopolises, but you kind of have to get good at this discrimination game of like examples and non-examples. And I'll give you some conceptual tools and building blocks to like put some structure into your intuitions here. Okay, here's a working definition. A cosmopolis is a geography shaped by a way of life induced by a major technology. I made this sketch map of a bunch of examples because I want to like drive in and anchor the notion that a cosmopolis is not this abstract, ethereal thing, but an actually geographically grounded concept, right? So you can see the footprints of some of these cosmopolises. It's not political geography and it's not physical geography. It's like something in between, right? So the green one in the middle, the green band, that's roughly, I would say, around 1100, the Islamic world, right? It covers most of the Middle East and further east as well, and parts of India. It covers parts of Europe. It covers lots of North Africa. And it's all unified by a single way of life, a single code of law. So Islamic law at that point was its height. So that's a good example to think about. A more modern example is all the blue things around the water. So you can think of that as a cosmopolis of sail, right? Centered around port towns. Very modern example, you can think of the tech cosmopolis. So I've indicated Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, the Bangalore region of India, parts of Europe, parts of Israel. So you can think of this mainly connected by air travel as a tech cosmopolis. There's a way of life that plays out in that geographical footprint, right? And you find them all over history. Okay. Somebody commented in my article yesterday that, hey, this sounds like the Noosphere, and there's a good connection. So thank you. I forget who said that. So I unpacked that connection a little bit. So the idea of the Noosphere actually was invented by two people who meant slightly different things. So Teilhard de Chardin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, he had kind of like a woo spiritualist notion of it, which is kind of a sphere of thought, like, a zone of enlightenment, a mind space, a human consciousness layer. And Vernadsky, who was a Russian thinker of around the same time, he thought of it as kind of a layer of Earth's geology. And both senses kind of matter for what I'm talking about as a cosmopolis. But I want to introduce a third one, which is a much more grounded kind of concept, which is the idea of a habitus, introduced by the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. I came across this when I was reading a book on chivalry called The Chivalric Turn. And the way to think about it is it's actually the layer of like behavioral norms that are kind of like partly conscious, partly unconscious. So chivalric culture is a good one, right? Like the knightly code of honor, these people behaved a certain way. They had a certain idea of what it means to have good conduct, and they relied on a certain technological and social environment. So I added the technological bit because it's underemphasized in the Bordeaux version. But horses, horse riding, swordsmanship, all that stuff was part of the technical context in which the habitus of chivalry unfolded. So I would say a cosmopolis is 20% noosphere in the first sense, 20% in the second sense, and about 60% technological habitus. So it's very much a grounded geographic concept, not floating up in the air. Let's work out an example. Think of the automotive cosmopolis, which I mentioned in my big list. So this is the set of people whose lives play out inside cars to a large degree, right? So it's all over the world. It's not just in a particular country or city. You can think of the first noospheric component as like, car mind. You're driving, you're listening to podcasts and talk radio, so your sensibility is shaped a certain way. Maybe you're thinking about your physical environment of traffic, but there's a lot else going on, right? The conscious and unconscious attitudes that go with a car-based lifestyle. Suburbia, nuclear families, attitudes towards how cities should be governed, what you think about electric vehicle tax credits, what you think about rail versus road, transit walks, wars, walkability. All this is what I think of as car mind, and that's one layer of the cosmopolis, about 20%. Another is just the physical infrastructure of car world, right? All the roads, all the big P protocols like traffic signal systems, the car factories that pump out cars, the laws of how to drive in different parts of the world. And finally, there's the habitus, the set of learned behaviors around how cars, how to use and live in cars. It's kind of artificial. It's not a very natural habit like evolved in biological nature, right? Like we know how to walk by stumbling as babies and we figure it out, and monkeys do that too. This is not like that. Car driving is not a natural behavior. It rests on a technological layer with its own conceptual categories. So for example, driving on the right and left-hand side of the roads are different. Licensing in different countries tests for different behaviors that matter in those contexts, right? And it's not a monolith. So the automotive cosmopolis, at the very least, breaks down into two major ones, right? There's left-hand drive and right-hand drive. Probably make it 4 actually, because there's like developing world chaotic traffic on both varieties, right? And like I said, it's technically contingent. It's not the same if you go to another technology. So for example, flying a helicopter is very different from driving a car. You're using a control called a cyclic, which is very different from a steering wheel, right? So that's a worked example. And to get a sense of where we are going to head next, think about how all this is changed by computation, right? So AI in cars gives you self-driving. Blockchains in cars gives you the idea of self-owning cars that can be unlocked with trusted NFTs or EIDs. VR or AR in cars, right? Like your GPS probably already simulates alternate routes when there's traffic, right? It says you can go in this other way. Sensor networks. Cars are like dense nodes of network of sensors that then get fed into the cloud, and now they're like data collection networks that capture a lot of information. In the EV future, they're going to be part of the power grid. All the batteries are going to be part of the power grid. They're going to be storage, electric storage nodes as well. So they're going to start converging the power network as well. Climate tech is going to be in cars. So this is a very different Cosmopolis that's emerging. And we'll become very different people by living in this emerging automotive Cosmopolis. Some more building blocks. I'm going to stay grounded in geography. So there are three basic logics you can think of when you think about geography. So one is territorial logic. So this is the logic of large flat areas, loosely conforming to physical geography, mountains, rivers, things like that, but managed through like political borders and persistent occupation. So there's people who live within certain borders persistently, and they manage it a certain way. Then there's what I think of as nodal logic. So these are small but tall areas where they're shaped by the converged and entangled presence of multiple important physical network nodes. So I'm reading that out because it's like a very careful construct here. So like transportation, trade, and water, and usually high density human presence, forming what I think of as supernodes. So I'm using all this abstract language because we're used to cities being the only kinds of nodes we are familiar with, but increasingly we're finding other things, right? Like container ports or data centers. These have nodal logic, even though they're not classic human density nodes. And the final one is behavioral logic. So areas shaped by human behaviors induced by a particular way of using technology, right? And this is mostly correlated with the cosmopolitical layer. So for example, the left-hand drive versus right-hand drive geographies are two different areas shaped by different behavioral logics. And this shows up at the physical layer as well, right? The signage on the roads is on different sites, for example. And yes, there's correlation, but all three logics affect all three units of our analysis: Cosmopolis, Metropolis, and nation state, but to different degrees. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay. I want to say a little bit about networks because we live in a world where the word network is like super over-indexed on. Everybody loves thinking in terms of networks, and it's most natural to start thinking about all this in terms of networks, but I've become convinced that network is actually not a useful building block for thinking. It's a good unit of technological analysis, but it's not an independent logic of geography because it lacks an independent constitutive capacity, by which I mean an independent capacity to shape geographic reality, right? And one way to like get a quick sense of this is in the physical world, often a network does not exist in isolation, right? The nodes are converged supernodes of many types of networks, and even the edges are the same way, right? So you have what are often known as utility corridors or transport corridors, where more than one network edge goes through, like road, telegraph, optic fiber cable, electricity, water, oil. All of them might share the same converged super corridor, right? And it's these corridors that are the politically active units of analysis, and sometimes they can sustain cosmopolises. So for example, I think the Silk Road is a legit cosmopolis. But I don't think the network is actually an independent logic of geography. So the short answer is no, and that has implications. What about social networks? This one's harder. So yeah, there have been stateless nations historically: Jews, Romas, displaced peoples, refugees. But my assessment is typically they've not shaped geography with autonomous logic. They kind of like act through the other three logics. Diaspora networks are kind of interesting. Many large, high population kind of like civilizations and cultures have like spread out through the world. You have Chinatowns in every part of the world. But again, I don't think it operates independently. It operates through the other three logics. But I'm not fully sure of this. So for example, steppe nomads and plains Indians might be edge cases where, yeah, it's maybe mostly a social network that's shaping geography. But mostly I've concluded this is also maybe leaning towards no. Okay. Another building block. So there's a reason I have distinguished logic and embodiments. So a logic can be embodied in many different ways, and territorial logic is actually the best example of that. So anywhere you go in history, you will find that large areas of land have been kind of carved up with different people laying claims to different chunks of land. And usually they install a totalizing political organizational form in there, right? So the most recent one of these is a nation state, which arose after 1647, the Treaty of Westphalia. But it's not the only one. Like before that, there was the classical imperial order, right? Before that, there was kind of the feudal political unit, which assembled into larger, like empire-sized units. I mentioned the Sanskrit Cosmopolis in Southeast Asia and parts of India. So this would be, I don't know, 300 BC to 380 or something. So this had what's sometimes called the mandala system of government, where the valuable commodity is not land, but people. And population density is very low. So it's actually more prominent in Southeast Asia than India, which is densely populated. But the mandala system is basically geography subservient to powerful rulers who basically raid each other and take slaves. And instead of like a map of territories, which kind of carves up the map in mutually exclusive ways, mandalas can overlap, right? So there are zones of influence. So territorial logic is a succession of political forms that displace each other. Nodal logic, basically the city. You can think of like other nodal logic supernodes, but basically think converged physical capital. And behavioral logic is basically everywhere people behave with a particular lifestyle, right? So Cosmopolis is the embodiment. And these three embodiments are not mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. They are like very messy and overlapping. I'll show you that structure in a minute. And aside, for those of you who want to like kind of like get into thinking about this stuff yourself, is I found it really useful to think about verbs that shape geographic logics, right? So displacement, for example, one new people comes in, displaces another new group, right? Modern Turkey is Turkey because Turkic people came and, at least at the elite level, displaced a lot of the Greek, Armenian, and other groups that were already there. So the population of modern Turkey is still, I would say, 80-90% genetic stock that used to be there historically, but it's now a Turkic polity, right? So that's a displacement thing. This is why the phrase post-nation state makes sense, because territorial logic operates by displacement. One thing comes in, another thing cycles out, right? So you can think of post-nation state, but it doesn't make sense to think of post-territorial. There will always be a territorial logic at work. The second kind of class of verbs is agglomeration, convergence. So these things are what define supernodes, so cities and things like that. And accretion, so layers, almost like geology. That's what creates cosmopolitical structures. So accretion is the verb to think of. And not all verbs induce logics of geography, and not all popular words are actually that important. So for example, connectivity, I think, is not actually that important because connections can easily be cut. They do not actually shape geography as strongly as you think. Purification. So take North Korea, for example, a very purist state that has like a state religion and ethnically very homogeneous. But these things tend not to be very stable. They're very easily contaminated and tend to be fragile or degenerative, right? Containment is another weak verb. You cannot really contain either people or ideas. They have a habit of leaking out, right? So think about what verbs you use in thinking about the world. Okay. This is my big, horrible diagram. I'll give you a second to stare at it while I take a sip of my coffee here. Okay, this is what I mean by non-MECE, not mutually exclusive or collectively exhaustive. We've got the planet, providing the basic layer of logic. Above that, we have continents, but I want you to think in terms of units of soil, as in the political term blood and soil nationalism, right? So this is usually, you might have phrases like sons of soil. So people very strongly attached to an idea of territorial identity, right? So which can compete actually with family identity. So usually historically there's been a tension, which I'll talk about there. But that's soil. So that's one embodiment abstraction, by which I mean many kinds of things can sit on that abstraction or fulfill the role of that abstraction, but that's the abstract category, like soil things. Then there are what we might think of as stack-like things, right? So cities are one embodiment, but anywhere where you have a converged supernode of many physical and conceptual networks, you've kind of got a high thing. This is what I meant by nodal logic is high but confined in small spaces. And the Cosmopolis is actually the hardest one to think about because it usually consists of conceptual blocks that can occur as part of stacks, but can also kind of float independently in between and form, like, you can take a backpack of books and go hiking in the woods, right? So you're still part of the Cosmopolis of print. You might be, living in a cabin as a recluse, exit person from society, but you're still part of the Cosmopolis of print. So this is why when you think at the planetary scale, parts of it are carved up into nation states. That's the big dotted rectangles. Parts of it are stack-like that are usually included within the national zones, but sometimes can be outside of them. So city-states are like cities that are claimed by multiple cultures or nations. But cosmopolises can often traverse what I think of as wildernesses, which is the green bubbly-looking thing in the middle. So not all of planetary realities covered by nation states and nodal logic entities, right? So there are wildernesses, and nation states and stack-like supernodes are usually bad at dealing with wildernesses. But one of the nice things about cosmopolises is they actually are pretty good at dealing with wilderness zones as well, right? So especially on the ocean. So you've got the oceanic cosmopolis of the age of sail. A lot of it was wild. There's a really wonderful book by, I think, William Languish called The Outlaw Sea, which talks about the modern cosmopolis of ocean shipping. So cosmopolises can traverse these zones, right? So this is my structural logic of how these building blocks start to fit together. Okay. I want to say, so the three embodiment abstractions are soil, stacks, and virtual soils. So virtual soils are what cosmopolises take root on. But I want to say something more about virtual soil. I think virtual soil is actually a memory substate. So I want to thank Kia Kreutler, who's running our memory special interest group, for getting me thinking hard about memory. But I think memory is extremely important in how civilizations constitute themselves, and not all geographic logics are equally good at holding memories. And it is my contention that of the three logics, territorial, nodal, and behavioral, memory mostly lies inside the behavioral layer. So cosmopolitical layers are kind of the memories of civilization, so they do most of the memory. Territories and cities do have some memory, but to first approximation, you could say territories and cities can forget, only the cosmopolis truly remembers. So if you want like a bumper sticker slogan, that's the bumper sticker slogan for this age. So this is one way to think about a dark age, which is the cosmopolitical layer kind of gets weak, right? So the civilization gets to be amnesiac. So one way to think about this is a cosmopolis is purely technological. If a particular technological layer vanishes, like everybody gets illiterate, the entire cosmopolis vanishes. This is not true of cities and territories, right? Like even if a city is emptied out and it's a ruin, the physical body lives. Even if the entire city is raised, like a natural harbor with a river flowing through it, it's kind of a proto-city. Similarly, a region with mountain borders or something, it's kind of a proto-nation state or territory, right? So there is something left when you take away the organizing logics of humans, but a cosmopolis is a purely human entity, right? And that's one reason it carries so much cultural memory. Okay, so here's my diagram of the tensions between among the three logics, right? So some of this will be familiar to you. So take, for example, territorial logic versus nodal logic. So this is the age-old conflict between nation-state-like entities, which includes historically things like empires, and city-like entities, right? And nation-states tend to define themselves with borders, but cities tend to define themselves with all the connections they maintain with other cities, right? So often those two are in conflict, and we are seeing a version of that play out these days, but it's a historic one. So I call that the corridors versus borders tension. economics versus borders is usually the tension between territorial logic and behavioral logic, and horizontal versus vertical is the behavioral versus nodal logic tension, right? And each of these nodes also has internal stresses and tensions. So the one I mentioned like 5 minutes ago, territorial logic within itself usually contains a tension between nation versus kin. So this goes back to like ancient Greece, right? So political leaders like to say that, you should really think of yourself as a son or daughter of the soil. You should think of your nation as the fatherland or motherland. You should kind of weaken your connection to your biological mother and father, and you should like treat the the nation or its equivalent in history as your parental entity, right? And there's like a lot of good historical and sociological unpacking of this concept, but this is an internal tension to territorial logic, and entire empires and nation states have been like torn apart by that particular tension. So these are like the sets of tensions we should be thinking about in all this. And the unhappy human's frowny face in the middle is my representation of the cosmopolitan's sort of like primal state, right? You're torn apart by all these different logics that are tearing you apart, which have their internal and mutual tensions, and you kind of have to find a way to like synthesize an identity out of all these, right? And it's not trivial, right? Most of you have struggled to do some version of this and like author your own selves in some way. Okay, so those are my building blocks. Let's talk about how to build with those blocks, which is building futures and narratives. But the particular class of like narrative futures I want to think about is cosmopolitical futures. Other people are thinking about nation state or city state type futures. But I do want to point you to 10 related classes of futures to the kinds I'm thinking about. So ordered roughly in order of like basically how much I like or dislike them. So I've just started diving into Yukui's work on cosmotechnics and cosmopolitics, which kind of seems very aligned with the way I've started to think. So this, by the way, is a fairly new way of thinking for me. I used to be much more of like a single technological future guy, and the basic essence of Yukui's model and my emerging model is there isn't just one tech future. So you can have like a divergent ecology of multiple ways technology and culture interact to create different sort of like milieus. And this is what I'm calling a cosmopolis. So there can be more than one internet. There's a Chinese internet and the Western internet, for example. The Cthulhu scene is kind of a more eco-oriented version of the kinds of thinking I'm doing. The Berggruen Institute people are doing a lot of good thinking at the planetary level. So I'm not a huge fan of this unit of analysis because it's too big in my opinion. You can't really think of the planet, but you should read the Niels Gilman and Jonathan Blake book. It's a really useful framework. Benjamin Bratton has been doing a lot of stack-based thinking, but I want to point out that key difference is he thinks of the stack as almost a planetary scale idea, and he's written a big fat book about it, and his recent work on hemispherical stacks kind of continues that thinking. But I've increasingly started identifying stacks with nodal logic. So I think stack logic primarily exists in entities like cities and things like that. I'm still working out how my notion of a stack differs from Bratton's, but it's, I would say, 30 degrees off. So it's still aligned, but pointing in the same broad direction. City-state world. So a lot of futures thinking people are really in love with this. I used to be in love with this too, and it's a real thing, right? So the C40 mayors group is trying to do climate action at a city level, but I've concluded that this is wishful thinking. Nodal logic is not powerful enough to run the world. Territorial logic is really overwhelmingly powerful, and you kind of need cosmopolitical logic to complete the picture and like create that three-way balance of power. And then there's a whole bunch rules-based international order. This is the old thing that's going back, and some people want it back. I don't. Balaji has his network state idea, which honestly I've concluded is basically wrong. Anarcho-capitalism, this seems to be the future Bitcoiners want, and I think it's like a weird fantasy. I'm not a huge fan of it. Number 9 is the track we are on, which is reactionary revanchist, essentially degrowth, even though it's right coded, and degrowth is often thought of as a left coded concept. If you swung the other way to left reactionary ideas, so like democratic socialists and others, you would still be in the number 9 bullet, and we are on this track. And as you can see, it's the worst in my list, and I prefer almost anything to it short of like actual collapse, and I'm not even sure about that. Like maybe collapse would be better than future number 9. So this is my opinion. You don't have to share it. Okay, so I want to give you some way of like putting these building blocks together. So here's one kind of like way to do this, right? So we've got 3 logics, and we've got kind of 3 classes of technologies. So we can think of soil technologies, right? Very physical, very much production oriented. They don't, they do carry some memory, but they don't have a lot of memory function. But agricultural technologies, mining technologies, and they are very strongly correlated with territorial logic. Then you've got, I won't talk through the whole matrix, but yeah, moving up the diagonal, converged local physical infrastructure is nodal logic, and this is stack technologies. There is a lot of memory there, but it's kind of like unconscious memory and physically coded, and it can become very cryptic, right? If a city gets ruined and the people get exterminated and a new population comes in, they may not even be able to decode what the city is saying, right? And then the top layer is the one I'm most interested in, which is memory technologies on virtual soil, right? And all 3 logics do have some element of that, right? So territorial logic is where myth and legend and ritual performance happen. Nodal logic is where archival memories, monumental history happens. But I'm mainly interested in what I was calling the habitus and Noospheric concepts and notions, which is memories encoded as behaviors that are like at least partly conscious and unconscious. So they have to be partly conscious because it's a cosmopolis, you consciously identify with it. It's not fully unconscious like some kinds of protocols are. Okay, going back to our diagram, each of these nodes kind of has, I would say, a memory footprint. So territorial logic is mainly affective, or what you could call sentimental memory. So myth and legend is how nation states write their narratives, as well as empires and civilizations. I would say nodal logic tends to preserve declarative history, right? Like if you go to a city which is the capital of a country, and there's a big agency like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there's a building with lots of computers and filing systems that have a lot of data about employment. And that's declarative memory about the past. And yes, it's vulnerable to capture and control and erasure. It's kind of happening in the US right now with employment statistics. Those tend to concentrate in nodal logic zones. But procedural memories tend to be very widely dispersed in a population, right? So the knowledge of how to live in the cosmopolis of cars is not concentrated in one building in Washington, D.C. It cannot be wiped out or nuked, right? Huge fraction of the world knows how to drive, knows how to repair cars, knows how to build cars. And if you erased all the physical infrastructure of cars, but kept the people and our behavioral knowledge, we could probably recover car technology, right? So that's how historical memory gets encoded in these 3 logics. I want to introduce another useful term here, which is articulation. So not articulation in the sense of speech, though it's kind of related, but articulation in the sense of mechanical joints, right? So your skeleton is an articulation of your mobility capability. So musculoskeletal system is an articulation. So memory can be thought of as an articulated hyperobject. It's not static or monolithic necessarily. Parts can move relative to each other. It can change shape. It can move around. It can take on different configurations. So think of memory as an articulated thing. So what do we mean by articulation of memory in relation to the 3 types of memory, right? So affective memory, know why. This is where meaning usually comes from. So myth, vibes, heritage, constantly telling and retelling stories. That's an effective memory articulation, and usually happens within the stories nation states keep telling themselves. Declarative memory is know what. So factual records, empirical data, things like that. And this again can be corrected, examined, changed, updated, memorialized, turned immutable with blockchains, things like that. So that's another kind of memory. And procedural memory is folk ways of life, behavioral logic, which can adapt and evolve. So all 3 of these have articulations in a mechanical sense, and they change and evolve over time. Let's work out an example. I'll give you a minute to eyeball this chart. So the recommended book for this, which is my favorite recommendation all summer, we read it in my book club this year, is Elizabeth Eisenstein's book, The Impact of Print on Early Modern Europe. I think that's the title. But it's really wonderful book that really helped me flesh out my thinking about how computers are impacting 2025. So this is a book about 1450 to 1600 or so. So that's the period of the book and what happened there. Right, and you can think of like we're like four to 500 years beyond the end of the period, but we can kind of see how the articulation of memory works in a print-based culture, right? So look in the territorial logic column. So you've got nationwide library systems and archives, high modernist bureaucracies with huge amounts of documents. You've got systematic translation efforts, right? Like, so Japan, for example, when it had its leap forward into modernity, they sent people to Europe to study European constitutions and write their own. They translated a lot of European works into Japanese, right? So there is a lot of nation-state territorial logic going on in print-based ecologies, right? And you shouldn't think only of like knowledge in the sense of books, but there's also knowledge in the sense of like, stamps, currency notes that run the economy. You can think of the literacy level, right? So you have to have consumption technologies as well. So you have to educate your population to be literate before they can be governed with a print-based territorial logic, right? Similarly, when you move over to nodal logic, you have more specialized schooling infrastructures associated with the converged physical nodes, right? Like there's documentation on the New York subway system and presumably detailed libraries and maps and blueprints and stuff like that. And schools you go to learn the technical knowledge to operate with that memory. And finally, you've got the behavioral logic of print-based memories, and this tends to have like a transnational extra state character to it, and often there's like a subversive tone to it, right? So print in the behavioral logic sense is even if the nation state decides to censor books or like ban books, and even if the publishing or media industry in New York or wherever says we are not going to publish this, it's part of a cosmopolis of print, and there is a habitus of behaviors that you can appeal to, right? So somebody can, like, through oral transmission, like convey a text across any kind of borders. You can just memorize a text and take it across. Then you can write it down and print it in the basement. Samizdat is a kind of literature that emerges like that. It can be transnational across political strife. So the Republic of Letters is an early example that Eisenstein analyzes. Okay. Apply the same kind of logic to computers. This is hard. This is very preliminary, I would say. I'll give you another, like maybe 30 seconds to eyeball this, because this is a complex picture. I want to talk about it a little bit. All right. Okay. This is very speculative because all these technologies are like less than 10 years old in the sense of like they're mature enough to talk about. I mean, in some sense, they've existed as like a cluster of research ideas for a long time. But in the sense that these are like planet-shaping forces that can induce new geographic logics, they're pretty new, right? Since the summer protocols and sponsored by Ethereum, let's talk about the middle row. You can see how blockchains factor out across territorial, nodal, and behavioral logic, right? In territorial logic, most countries that are threatened by the idea of crypto and blockchains, they're like pursuing some sort of like CBDC, central bank digital currency scheme, right? It's an attempt to create the equivalent of a hybrid engine between fiat national currencies and transnational cryptocurrencies, right? There are lots of EID schemes going on. Stable coins, I think, ridiculous amount of transactional volume is going on, like 70 trillion in transactional volume in the last few years or something. So this is moving money. So this is not trivial stuff, but there is a bucket of stuff that's blockchains crossed with territorial logic. When you move down to the nodal logic level, people talk of smart cities with their own, like, blockchain-based things going on. You can have EIDs, you can have smart city infrastructures, and so forth. And finally, of course, as you might expect, the most of the lore around blockchainy things is around spaces that are not organized by either territorial or nodal logic, but behavioral logic. So there is such a thing as a cosmopolis of crypto, right? The Ethereum version of it plays out in all the big Ethereum events, but there's like a larger thing. And beyond that, I would say there's like a protocol Cosmopolis that even people who don't like crypto, like say the Blue Sky people or ActivityPub people, they still think in this sort of like mental model, right? And they all think outside the logic of territories and nodes. AI, very difficult to think about, but some of the elements are already obvious. Like already it's clear that the US and China are the only two entities currently big and powerful enough to build the big foundation models, right? I mean, where are you going to build a gigawatt scale data center to train I don't know, multi-trillion parameter models? The US and China are probably the only places. I was chatting briefly with Benjamin Bratton, and he's trying to do stuff to make a European AI happen. I'd give that like a less than 50% chance. And other, like, the BRIC nations, they just don't have the critical mass. So a lot of AI, I would say, is heavily bound by territorial logic, but it doesn't have to be, right? Cities have another advantage. They might not be able to necessarily have the resources to run gigawatt scale data centers in their backyard, but they're extraordinarily rich data sources, right? They're they're converged super nodes of lots of network infrastructure and a lot of good data that's like, not pure text or pure images, actually is like generated and cycled and consumed in cities, right? Like if you want traffic data, if you want housing data, if you want like data on like water flowing through plumbing, all that is city data. So cities have like leverage with data. And of course, if you want distributed public protocolized AI, model context protocol is an example. Kevin Kelly's been talking about public AI. He has a talk in our series. Protocol social media. You can think there's a lot of like attempts to like cross crypto and blockchains with AI. None of them are quite working yet, but things like privacy, zero knowledge proofs, all that obviously fit in the top right corner of how you like distribute AI, right? And you do want to like pay attention to the stuff that feels a little boring because we were talking a lot about it 10 years ago and it feels dead, but it's not. IoT is not dead. There's like 50 trillion, or is it 50? Yeah, I think there's like either 50 billion or trillion, I don't know which it is, but devices, IoT devices in the world. If you look at like, the number of say ESP32 microcontrollers in the world, it's like exploding. Our world is full of IoT stuff, and you may call it the Internet of Crap, but it's there. We've stopped talking about it, but it continues to grow. VR, AR, everybody's like making fun of Mark Zuckerberg and thinking that Meta's metaverse thing has failed. I would not write it off. There's a lot of training and simulation that happens for AI. NFTs and things like that make most sense in like VR, virtual world environments where you can own digital objects. And virtual realities, I think, they're going to be big. I mean, they're a part of the mix that we still haven't quite wrapped our mind around, but eventually we'll end up with like mirror worlds and things like that have been talked about for decades. And here again, the behavioral logic side of it is just open hardware, end-to-end encryption capacity, open planetary data infrastructures. I was recently reading about how the Trump administration has basically carved up and sold off the National Weather Service's capabilities, and it's become like corporate captured pile of political nonsense. But what do we do about it? Like, you and I can't run our own planetary weather systems and predict hurricanes, but hey, could we possibly build an open commons based on open, cheap hardware? Like, why? So a big part of weather prediction is sending up weather balloons, and they're expensive, but not that expensive. Why can't we have a global commons public network of weather balloons that are run by individuals outside of the logic of like nation states and cities, and we have like the Linux of open weather prediction? So this is possible. This is not science fiction. It just requires somebody with the will to imagine that future and try to make it happen. So this is the articulation of computation-based memories. The whole planet is becoming evolving memory system with computers. All right, so in the title, I said 3 protocols for articulating civilizational memory. These are the 3. So if territorial logic continues to dominate and combines with computing tech, you'll basically get centralizing protocols and monolithic civilizational memory, right? You will have, like, you can imagine 30 years on, you put on a VR headset and you're either in the Chinese version of world history or in the American version of world history, and they're completely different, but two different monoliths, right? So that's monolithic protocols in the future. Nodal logic, right now, we are thinking of it as like city-state stuff, but it's actually a direction rather than a particular scale. It tends to oozify, right? Like decentralization can get arbitrarily fine-grained. Even at the metro level, you can see like metropolitan regions tend to sprawl and bleed into each other. So you have what we call the Acela corridor in the northeast part of the United States, right? So Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York, it's a corridor that's just one large sprawling exurbian zone. This is the sort of thing Neil Stephenson likes to write a lot of novels about. But this is, I think, of the nodes, the converged super nodes have started running into each other, and they're annealing and oozing into each other. It's like annealing is this metallurgical process where you heat treat layered piece of metal up and down, heat it, cool it, and the layers start to get entangled with each other. That's what starts to happen if nodal logic is taken to an extreme. So I think of it as oozy civilizational memories. And then behavioral logic is, I think, solving for liveness, because you're not fundamentally thinking in structural terms. But if you converge, if you take behavioral logic and computing tech together, you get protocols of circulation, really, like value moving around in a cosmopolitical layer. And this is there's something live about it. So I think of the big three protocols as either you're solving for totalizing aesthetic dominance, so you own the entire narrative. You're solving for physical longevity. This is why cities are very long-lived. They're like practically eternal. Or you're solving for liveness, right? So this is behavioral logic. I haven't thought this through, but there's probably some sort of impossible trilemma here that would be fun to work out. So maybe you guys can think about it and share your thoughts. And preliminary answers to the questions I opened with. Is cosmopolitan the same thing as being a globalist? No, that's the bunch of oligarchic fat cats at Davos trying to run the world. It's not cosmopolitanism. Is it big city types? Not quite. There's a lot of overlap. I wrote more about this in the essay, but basically, no. Cosmopolitanism is not being a big city type. Is it different from being a nationalist? I think the reason nationalists are so afraid of cosmopolitanism is they like to frame it as a more abstract, ephemeral, elite, sort of kind of thing. But it's actually a more basic mode of being, and it's what rushes in to fill the vacuum when nation states or units of territorial logic, when they start to weaken or collapse or shrink. Cosmopolitanism starts to rush in and starts to fill the vacuum, right? So that's one reason they're afraid of it, because even though it's very conceptually based and seemingly ephemeral, cosmopolitanism is one of the oldest sort of accretive aspects of geographic reality. It's extremely robust, and it's because it's so based in technological evolution. So I wrote more about this in the essay. So yeah, it tends to prevail long term. That's why other ways of constructing identities tend to be hostile to it. How is it different from metropolitan logics, nodal logics? It's horizontal rather than vertical is my basic answer. How is it related to technology? So unlike territorial logic and nodal logic, cosmopolitan logic is almost entirely technologically constructed, which makes people think it's fragile, but it's not. And what are protocols to do with any of this? Well, a Bender joke here, but a Cosmopolis has 40% protocols. So the big answer is a cosmopolitan is someone who inhabits the most robust articulations of historical memory available, which tend to be associated with the accreting cosmopolitical logic of geography and history. So those are my preliminary answers. Hopefully it's a start of a longer conversation. I broke out the 9th question on the opening side of why do we care? This is a question all of you have to answer for yourself. But for me, I mean, it's fairly straightforward, right? The world is headed in a certain direction. It was heading in a different direction that I liked better. And you have to ask yourself, so I don't like where it's headed. Can it go back to heading in a direction I like? Is that some version of the old direction or some entirely new thing? I don't know. But the two possible answers are there's some sort of cyclic dialectic here where you swing between ethno-nationalist futures and cosmopolitan futures, and it goes back and forth on its own, and you don't have to do anything. You just have to wait it out. That's one theory. Another theory is this is a secular shift that's going to move human history down a particular path. And if you don't do something, it's actually going to continue down that path, which means you have to act. The futures you want may not actually happen. And then there's a third possibility that all the things we think we know are all kind of like basically bullshit, and entirely new kinds of futures are coming into being. But yeah, this is an important question. Why do you care is a question you have to ask and answer for yourself. All right. So that's the talk, and I want to do a little spiel here of where you can go if you want to follow this conversation. So we are doing this thing called the Protocol Symposium in September, September 12th to 19th, so a full week. It'll start off with this thing in the leftmost, the foundations workshops, so 2 days trying to work out like a formal foundations theory of, with logic and math. So that'll be this is all going to be online. So that'll be Friday and Saturday, 12th and 13th. Then the next week, Monday 15th to Friday 19th, we'll run what's called the Protocol School, which will have these 9 sessions that you see here, taught by 9 people who we've just given protocol grants to through the Summer Protocols program. So they'll each be teaching courses. So you're just eyeballing the titles, you can kind of see that there's it unpacks lots of the things I've talked about today, right? So all these are going to be 90-minute intensive crash courses, basically taught by experienced faculty. So they'll be really good. And I've been working with them all summer, so it's actually turning out to be really good material. You'll love it. But I do want to point out that besides that, we also have a third component which will go in parallel with the courses, which is hackathons and co-working. So in particular, we'll do hackathons related to storytelling in terms of what we call protocol fiction. So you can imagine cosmopolitan futures through storytelling. And we will talk about understanding business and organizational problems. So those are 2 hackathons we'll be running. Let me actually share the page here. Let's share this tab. So if you go to summerprotocols.com, this is and click on the banner there, you'll get to this page. Protocol Symposium. There's 3 components. The due date is August 22nd for both. Click on the Foundations workshop. There's registration form there, but this is for kind of more mathy people who kind of want to get math nerdy about it. So it'll be a set of like Zoom sessions with asynchronous conversations in between. We'll probably do 4 Zoom sessions, but in between we'll work together on some sort of like roadmap document on how to build this theory. And the school is, those are the pictures you saw. But those of you who want and do like a protocolish project and attend enough of these sessions, you'll earn a protocol school certificate. You don't have to. You can just sign up and attend, but capacity is limited. There will be let's see. And the third one, this page we haven't yet fleshed out on hackathons and co-working session. Watch this space, we'll flesh it out better in the next couple of weeks. But here's the calendar. You've got like a packed 7 days. And apply to this August 22nd. Looking forward to seeing a lot of you there. And we'll continue much more detailed versions of these conversations. So maybe we have a few minutes for questions. I can stay on, Timber.
Okay, we do have a few questions. I'll bring the ones from YouTube up on screen and bring that. First one, very straightforward. Will the slides be made available?
Yes.
Okay, we can move on. Second one, are you going to make Dark Age bumper stickers?
Yeah, the Dark Age thing is like some fun I'm having on Substack with like trying to write stories for this stuff. Not bumper stickers, but I am trying to write microfictions, set in this future because,
On a more serious note, Robbie asks, could genetics be thought of as a territorial level memory? Over a long enough Cosmopolis engagement, the memory becomes ingrained in genetics. Example.
So gone back and forth about this. So epigenetics has been a hot topic, and some of it is like kind of faddish. I'm not sure how much I believe it, partly because it's like very politically charged. And if you're like, a particular kind of left-leaning sensibility, it's an attractive belief system to adopt that it's basically Lamarckian evolution, right? An entire community goes through a trauma. That trauma affects the epigenetics, and therefore it gets inherited. So, for example, Jewish Holocaust trauma is an example that's cited. Another one is Koreans have this concept called Han, which is their history of occupation and conflict with Japan and China and so forth. So Koreans are like stereotypically very hot-tempered, and one of the cultural epigenetic type explanation some people like to offer is, hey, maybe it's this Han that's in their epigenetic blood. So yes, there's plausible reasons for thinking this might be true, but I'm honestly not convinced. It's a little too convenient for certain politics to believe in genetics as a territorial logic, but I'm open to the possibility. Let's see what research says.
Next question is from Elena on Substack, which I can't bring up on screen. And I think you touched on this, but she asked, how do diasporas relate to Cosmopolis?
So I think I had a couple of bullet points in the slides. I go back and forth, and it's actually related to the epigenetic type of thing. I mean, there's a wonderful atlas that some of you may be interested in buying. It's called the Penguin Atlas of Diasporas. I bought it like 20 years back. I don't know if it's been updated, but it's kind of like a beautiful object when you look at how much the world has been shaped by very structured streams of migration. Like if you talk to nation state people, they will always talk of migration and movement in like apocalyptic barbarian terms, right? Like you've got the Camp of Saints book, which the right wing loves. You've got like Trump describing things as like caravans and invasions. But if you actually look at the sociology and structure of migratory movements, there's a lot of deep sociological structure here. This is like societies on the move, retaining a lot of their internal structure, logic, and intelligence. And diasporas are kind of the more, I would say, often diasporas emerge out of like refugee crises and like displaced peoples and stuff, but that's not always the case, right? Like look at the Hakka people and the culture they've spread through the world. They're a migratory, trading focused Chinese group, and it's kind of a business community. So another one is Gujaratis from India. You go all over the world, you'll see lots of Indian grocery stores named Patel Grocers. Patel is a Gujarati last name. That's a diaspora. But I'm not convinced that they're an independent unit of analysis here, because they tend to rely on and operate through territorial, nodal, or cosmopolitical logics, right? They wouldn't exist without it, and they tend to collapse, and they're fragile to actions in the other three logics.
Okay, great. We have one from Sachin now, and he said, is Cosmopolis a way of turning information into memory?
I think that's actually a very good, succinct definition, and we should probably provoke Kia's memory research group to think about this more, because I think I've laid down a couple of premises I'm like 60% confident of, but not entirely sure. I said a cosmopolis is a specific embodiment of the abstract embodiment of a virtual soil, right? Like, so print culture is a virtual soil. It potentially has a memory substrate-like property, and therefore it can hold memories. And yes, print culture transforms information into memory, and the print cosmopolis is the steward of that memory. But this is a fairly unwieldy, large-scale, big history hypothesis that I don't want to like put too much load on before people think about it harder. But I want to like put it out there. So thanks, Sachin. Yeah, good cue.
Bit of a definitional one here, getting into the semantics now. How does Cosmopolis differ from culture? I can see a number of parallels, so trying to understand the logic of the format.
I would say that's a tough one. Cultures, I think, are more associated with territorial logic and the affective patterns of memory they have. And you can see this in ideas like, Hofstede's notion of cultural distance, right? So this is Geert Hofstede, one of the interesting theories you can think about. Think about the idea of most favored nation status and, the Anglosphere and like political alliances that emerge out of that, right? The United States trusts Canada, the UK, and Australia more than it trusts, say, continental Europe, much more than it trusts Russia, much more than it trusts Asia, things like that. And based on this, very sort of legible networks of alliances form. Now, there's twists to this tale. So, for example, the Trumpist political movement does not like the most favored nation logic in some ways, and it's trying to rewire it in different ways. But I think based on that kind of dynamic, I would say culture is more associated with territorial logic and perhaps nodal logic. And the cosmopolitical does have a cultural element, but I think it lies more at what Bordeaux called the habitus layer, right? So chivalric culture, you can call it culture, but chivalric culture is more of a habitus, a code of conduct kind of thing. And it sort of exists in the same space in history and time as, say, early medieval European Christendom, right? So if you think of like King Arthur's tales, it's both a cultural artifact and a cosmopolitical artifact, right? The cultural side is there is mythic narratives, the King Arthur tales, there's the search for the Holy Grail that fits into the mythos of European Christianity. So all that fits within the cultural logic of Europe, defined by territorial logic. But the cosmopolitical aspect of it is like chivalric culture that has more resonances with, say, Japanese Bushido and similar kind of like, martial cultures, Rajput culture. So the habitus layer is kind of different from culture. So this is worth thinking about, I think.
We are 5 past the hour, but there are 2 more questions if you're game.
I can keep going. Yeah, let's get through all of them.
What are your thoughts on degrowth, and how would you tackle climate change utilizing the concept of Cosmopolis?
This is one of the biggest, hardest questions. And this is also one of the reasons I'm highly skeptical of the abundance movement and basically unbridled modern, right-leaning Silicon Valley logic, which is, if you oppose that to, say, Vaclav Smil's planetary logics of like, resource constraints and stuff, I'm not a degrowther. I think degrowth in the forms practiced by both the left and the right, there are left and right versions of degrowth, is basically both inhumane and stupid. Like inhumane in the sense that, hey, if you're talking about degrowth, you're probably sitting somewhere in a fairly rich, developed country region, probably utilizing 40 times the material resources that a kid in sub-Saharan Africa is. It's easy for you to sit around and talk about degrowth and say use less. You're already using 40 times more than the least privileged person. So there's something very disingenuous about that, whether it's left-leaning or right-leaning. But that's a moral argument. There's also sort of like a descriptive material argument, which is, the Buckminster Fuller idea of do more with less, ephemeralization. Can you, if you move the entire energy infrastructure from fossil fuels to renewables, can you have the same standard of living with a much smaller resource base? That's not degrowth, but it does use fewer material resources, right? Like Texas is a very red state dominated by red politics, but it has some of the harshest climate-affected weather going on right now. And it's surviving really well because it meets about 40+% of its energy needs through renewables, which is one of the great narrative violations of our time, Texas and renewable energies, right? So no, I'm not a degrowther. Yes, I do think the concerns of the degrowth movement do need to be taken seriously. And, feel-good abundance arguments and like growth for endless growth is just kind of like given to us. That's bullshit. You have to think about these things hard.
Good answer. And last question here over on Substack, so I'll read it out. It strikes me that the conditions and impulses for developing coordination and syntropic capability are more likely to arise in the face of threats that necessitate them. Might we see the potential of the red futures as a precondition for the Cosmopolis?
So the Cosmopolis is kind of an always already background entity, right? It just waxes and wanes in responses to other things waxing and waning. The Cosmopolis tends to be sort of a reactive space of civilizational surplus, both material and cultural and ideational, right? That's a complex phrase, so let me unpack that. Like take the most recent era of like cosmopolitan peak. When I came to the US in 97, one of the first things I did in 1998 after I'd saved a bit of money was buy a backpack, stuff it with stuff, and go off on a 3-week backpacking tour of Europe, which was wonderful. It was like a hugely mind-expanding, wonderful experience. And this was before cell phones, before Google Maps. I had to walk around with a big fat Lonely Planet, so it was part of the print Cosmopolis. There were hostels. I was backpacking. I was meeting and talking with people, having fun. This culture is in retreat. You couldn't experience what I did now. You can still travel. You'd have to like work through lots more annoying border issues. There would be a lot more crap you'd have to deal with. But even if you dealt with it and did all of this, it would be a very different experience. So I kind of feel sad for young people leaving college right now that they can't have the mind expanding positive experience I did. So yes, there's a dialectic between cosmopolitan states of mind and behavior versus non-cosmopolitan. But asking, is the threat of one the impetus for the evolution and invigoration of the other, is actually applying territorial logic, right? Like territorial narratives often have that feature, right? You have somebody like Trump or somebody similar in other countries manufacturing an external threat saying, hey, this big enemy is coming at us, therefore we must come together in solidarity and defend ourselves, right? This kind of logic of conjuring up a monster that's outside your logic and threatening your logic as a way to consolidate and propagate your logic, that's territorial thinking, and to some extent nodal thinking as well. It's easy to say that this is like a right-wing nationalism kind of thing, but left-wing nationalism does this too, and nodal logics do this too. The city of San Francisco, it has a lot of problems. There are nodal logic problems that are the effect of a siege mentality, and Trump might be building border walls, but San Francisco has this zoning and NIMBY kind of stuff going on. So there's that kind of logic, and it also has its own monsters. I would say one of the most psychologically healthy aspects of the cosmopolitan mindset is it does not require monsters for its narrative logic. It tries to tell stories that don't have monsters. And this is actually a storytelling discipline and practice that we're trying to cultivate in the Protocolized magazine with what we're calling strange rules fiction. So monsters implies heroes, and if you have hero-centered narratives, you kind of have special people narratives. So heroes are special people, monsters are special bad people or bad entities, and you tell stories using those entities. You have a certain kind of narrative culture. Cosmopolitan dispensations, I think, require you to get past that. You kind of have to tell stories without heroes or monsters. You can still have different kinds of monsters, maybe fun monsters, I don't know, but yeah, you kind of have to tell your stories differently.
Yeah, that is a real challenge. We do have two more questions that trickled in.
Keep going, yeah.
As well. Another one from Sachin. You mentioned there being cycles of suns of soil eras and Cosmopolis eras. What causes the transition between those eras?
I think there's a book called What's the Matter with Kansas that is a good lens on the most recent American version of this cycling. At a basic level, it's like people living in the non-urban hinterland developing basically moral panics and false beliefs about what city people are, what they do. So the theory in rural Kansas, I'm giving you the silly version of this, is that city people are basically resource sucks. It's all poor minorities living on welfare, draining all the wealth that's created by the hinterland people. And of course, city people have their own version of this, which is all the modern productive wealth creation actually happens in cities, and the hinterland is full of free riding farmers living off ag subsidies. That's the dynamic, right? Sons of soil versus evil degenerate city people. That's the version that plays out in the What's the Matter with Kansas narrative. But you see this all over, right? Russia versus Ukraine, and take the city of Odessa, which I think was a big center of Jewish culture, humor, nightclubs, all these things that we associate with cosmopolitanism. And this is one reason in Eastern Europe and that part of the world where cosmopolitanism and nation-state hatred of cosmopolitanism often is thinly veiled anti-Semitism. Cosmopolitanism is often associated with Jewish culture. And here I'm not commenting on the Gaza situation, but more generally. And this is true. the Jewish people are the most visible as like symptom of this, but you can see the same with the Roma, for example, who've been another mobile population. So what causes this cycle? I think because there are natural economic cycles and patterns of like, shifting wealth creation. Sometimes wealth creation happens more in like quote unquote soil. Sometimes wealth creation happens more in nodes. There's like they play off each other. Technologies invented in cities may go and improve like agricultural work. Agricultural surpluses may actually let you do more things in cities. So there's like a complicated picture here, but humans don't like complicated economic cycle pictures. They want to like create heroes and villains. This is why cosmopolises are good. But yeah, I think these are probably economically driven. Stuff sucks, you want somebody to blame, and the easiest people to blame are the people inhabiting regions you're not. So that drives the cycle. And sometimes it turns into long running festering wounds like anti-Semitism that are, a scarred kind of civilizational memory that lives in those layers.
Yeah. Okay. And here we have one from Jan over on Substack. Kwame Anthony Appiah, in his book Cosmopolitanism, outlines an ethical dimension to being cosmopolitan. Do you think the tension that cosmopolitans feel from having to be pulled between the logics you talk about also has an ethical dimension?
Absolutely, but I'm not a very strong or conscious ethical reasoner, so I haven't thought too much about it. And Jan, actually, I know you have thought about this a lot. So for those who don't know, you should follow Jan on Substack. He's a Burmese expat living in Chiang Mai, and he and his friends do a lot of wonderful work with the situation in Myanmar and what's going on there. So that's like, so this is not an abstract question for Jan and his buddies. It's like a very live question. Many of the things we're talking about, like including like, using blockchain-based currencies to run shadow economies against the Myanmarese government, things like that. There's a lot going on in this stuff. And you cannot operate within such real on-the-ground complex narratives that present ethical dilemmas without bringing some moral reasoning and ethical reasoning to the picture. I have been privileged enough that I haven't myself been put into hard ethical quandary situations. So to the extent I have an ethics that I bring to my cosmopolitanism, it hasn't been tested as yet. But yes, basically yes. And I would love help thinking through the ethical strand of this from Jan and others who care about that a lot.
Yeah, I highly recommend people join the Discord to share their thoughts on all this. We just about crossed 1,100 people that are members of the server. So there are lots of people there to hang out with. Yeah, I'll hand over the wheel to you. And when you're done, give a wave and I can end the stream.
All right. And yeah, you will, let's see, Timber will share the link to the slides, the Discord, the protocol symposium. Please do apply. There's like 1 week left. So I'm hoping to see a lot of you there. So back to you, Timber.
Okay. Yeah, I will share the link to everything in the chat. Thank you, Venkat, for the awesome stream. I highly recommend you subscribe to Protocolize to keep up with everything. Apply to the symposium by August 22nd and join the Discord to meet some collaborators who have been here in the YouTube and Substack chats with you. We have a guest talk next week with Nathan Schneider, who's been doing an awesome project called the Oral History of Protocols, and he'll be sharing what he's learned there. And we'll see you all next week.